Good afternoon, everyone. I cordially welcome you all to the ninth lecture of the short course on cultural linkages towards an Asian ideology. Today, we are focusing on building an Asian community, political issues, and challenges. The program for today is such that the lecture is scheduled to be for 45 minutes with a short break of 5 minutes, followed by a question and answer session. May I have the honor of introducing our guest lecturer, Mr. Nuwan Herat, Head of Department of Social Sciences of the Faculty of Management, Social Sciences and Humanities at General Sir John Kothawala Defence University. Our esteemed guest holds a Master of Arts in Peace Studies from the University of Notre Dame in the USA, a Master of Arts in Conflict, Peace and Development Studies from the Tribhuvan University in Nepal, and a Bachelor of Arts in Peace and Conflict Resolution with a first class from the University of Kelaniya in Sri Lanka, as well as 2 diplomas in human rights and in psychology. Mr. Nuwan Herat is a senior academic in the field of social sciences with many years of experience teaching at university level. Subjects he has taught at KDU includes sociology, political science, psychology, international relations, global politics, political economy, and conflict analysis and resolution. Mr. Herat has held positions such as senior lecturer at the Department of Social Sciences at KDU, visiting lecturer at the Sri Lankan Air Force Academy, and visiting lecturer at the University of Kelaniya. Outside of lecturing, he has served at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame in the USA, the Constitution Assembly election in Bhojpur in Nepal, and at the Foundation for Coexistence in Sri Lanka. Mr. Herat has contributed his vast academic knowledge to the real world by conducting research on monastic reforms, post-war Sri Lanka, and human rights violations, to name a few. He has also been awarded the NORAD Scholarship for a MA in Conflict, Peace, and Development Studies in Tribhuvan University, and the Joan B. Kroc Institute Scholarship for a MA in Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. His most recent achievements includes the successful obtaining of a grant of more than rupees 21 million by the United Nations Development Programme, the Department of Social Sciences at KDU, to conduct a project on promoting nonviolent communication and responsible use of media. Sir, we're profoundly honored to have you with us here, and we warmly welcome you to deliver this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive introduction. And I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Hemantha Premaratna, coordinator of this Eurasia Foundation program, for selecting me to have this lecture on political issues and challenges. And also I would like to thank the Dean of the faculty, Mr. Kitsuri Amaratunga, also for selecting me to deliver this lecture. So in this lecture, I will not be attempting to sort of give you a kind of a more prescriptive type of a lecture about sort of how to overcome the political issues and challenges in Asia. But rather than that, I will just give you an overview of some of the challenging political issues in Asia. So I will try to give you an overview of what are the pressing challenges at the moment in Asia, and also how we could really think about sort of building a kind of a, a sense or cohesion, a sense of cohesion about a one Asian community. So to begin with, building an Asian community, what I meant with building an Asian community is about actually building healthy relationships and structures among people and nation states in Asia with a positive sense of Asianness. So when I say with a positive sense of Asianness, that also implies that there is a negative sense of Asianness as well. Now, this famous scholar Edward Said, in his seminal work Orientalism in 1978, talked about how Westerners looked at societies in Asia and Africa. So in his book, he elaborated how the Western gaze towards Asia is more encompassed with negative images. They looked at Asia as a kind of a, a mysterious place, a place to be civilized with their democratic norms and values and practices. So we Asians sometimes also have, to a certain extent, I think, have internalized this Western gaze about Asia, and we even maintain some negative ideas about this Asianness. That is maybe because of the political issues, pressing political issues, economic inequality, income disparity, environmental issues, and so on. But I would like to sort of emphasize that we can also sort of critically engage with the images, particularly in the Western world, in movies and their writings, how they have looked at Asia, and how we could sort of try to become more different from their gaze rather than trying to internalize. So anyway, there are a number of cultural linkages that can help towards making this sense of one Asianness or this cohesion. They can be religion, language, ethnicity, business, tourism, sense of regionalism, different values and our ways of life as Asians. So these factors actually can be considered as connectors. But also, when some of these factors get politicized, let's say, for example, religion, language, ethnicity, these factors can act as dividers. So that is the ambivalent nature of some of these factors. For example, religion. Religion can be a great source of social harmony, a great platform for social harmony and cohesion, and almost all the great religions in the world actually originated in Asia. But if we think otherwise, religion has also been a main source of conflict in Asia. Islamic radicalization, conflicts between Buddhists and Muslims in Southeast Asia, and so on. So that is the ambivalent nature. So in today's lecture, I'll be focusing more on these dividers and giving you some sort of an idea about some of the pressing political issues in Asia, rather than spending more time on connectors, because I think you have had enough about the cultural linkages and connectors. So political issues or these dividers can hold back any advancement towards a common understanding. So this lecture will briefly discuss some of the following political issues, such as ideological differences, differences in political systems, political competition or power struggles in Asia, civil wars, unresolved political conflicts, issues related to modernization or resistance to modernization, politics of inequality, issues in identity, and so on. Right. So the first political issue and challenge that I have selected to discuss is about these ideological differences. So nation states are influenced by different political ideologies in their formation as well as in their function. Now, ideology is it's a set of ideas that lies underneath in political systems. Ideology is a philosophy about designing and functioning uh, of goals of a government or a state. So any political institution or political entity, there can be an underlying ideology. So in Asian context, in nation states in Asia, from left to far right, there are different types of political ideologies. And also I want to make note here that some of these political ideologies are actually have a sort of an origin in the Western world. So most of the Asian countries have customized these uh, political ideologies according to their context. For example, the Maoist ideology it's a kind of a contemporary variant of the Marxist ideology, which originated in China. So Marxist, Leninist, liberal, Islamist, nationalist ideologies have dominated nation states in Asia. And interestingly, there are states with contrasting ideologies actually sort of exist in proximity to each other as well. So that is the diversity in Asia, the political diversity in Asia. So these overarching political ideologies in nation states can influence policymaking, public attitude, and external relations of individual states. So the challenge is when we think about sort of a one Asianness or one Asian ideology or one Asian identity, how do we sort of not to really overcome these political ideologies, but to transcend these ideologies and differences. So if I just give you a, show you a map of different political positions of the ruling parties in Asian context, you can see a stark difference in certain places. For example, if you take India and China, far left and right wing, two countries. Towards the Arab side, you see no political parties in black. Some countries, no clear political ideology. Some are more centrist and more lenient towards West, more lenient towards leftist ideologies. So likewise, there are sort of difference in political ideologies that govern these countries. So when it comes to building or identifying the cultural linkages, we also need to take into consideration of how these nation states are influenced by different political ideologies. And the second challenge is different systems of government that prevalent in Asia. So Asia is probably the most diverse in that sense as well. So the ideological differences that I have mentioned before, along with some other factors such as historical factors, regional factors, colonial legacies of different countries, have formed different political systems. So Asia, we can see some of the highly populated democracies. Let me just ask you a question. What is the largest democracy in the world? Anyone in the
India?
Yes. what is the oldest democracy in Asia?
Sri Lanka.
Yeah. So democracies, Asia has having the largest democracy, and Sri Lanka, as Sri Lankans, we can also sort of be proud of being the oldest democracy in Asia, with an uninterrupted record of periodical elections, despite certain political issues. And also, there was just, I think, one attempt in 1962 that was actually a failed military coup. But Sri Lanka's democracy has sustained. But in addition to that, in other countries, we can see autocracies or dictatorships like in North Korea. There are constitutional monarchies like Malaysia, Thailand, Bhutan, absolute monarchies like Saudi Arabia, and one party rule. One particular political party is ruling the country, like China, and so on. So there are different systems of governance backed by different political ideologies in Asia. So different systems of government shape the political culture of the respective states. Stark differences and contrasting differences can hinder the cooperation between states and communities. Just think about a dictatorship versus a liberal democracy. A classical example is the Korean case, the North Korea versus South Korea. So even though there are strong cultural linkages that we can see in these two countries in terms of kinship, in terms of historical, lineage, different individual relationships, these political differences in terms of government systems and ideologies have set these communities apart from cooperating and maintaining close relationships with each other. Now, those are the real challenges when we think of sort of building a one nation community. So the next important point that I want to bring here is the Asia is also home for a serious political competition. So unlike other regions, Asia is experiencing a competition of superpowers for regional and global dominance. The rivalry between China and India since 1962 Sino-Indian War, due to a border dispute in Himalayan region, has actually once again sparked in 2020 also. So it's, it's very, the situation and the military power of these two countries is very different from 1962 to now, but still the issue has persisted and it is unresolved. So the rise of China and India as superpowers, yet as traditional rivalries, will certainly intensify their competition for dominance in the Asian context. Now, the crucial point here is that this is also going to be affected to some of the other tiny nation states in Asia. For example, if we think about like Nepal, which is sandwiched between India and China, which is a landlocked country. So how Nepal is going to manage its political future within this, ongoing power struggle between China and India? the internal politics of this tiny nation will also be decided by this power structure. The change of regimes, affiliations to, and also I think you know that most of the Nepal's supplies are controlled by India because it's a landlocked country. And also this scenario is very much common to Sri Lanka as well. Now Sri Lanka, since 1505 as an island nation, has been under continuous influence of global superpowers. Portuguese at that time, Dutch, and the British. Even after 1978, the influence of United States and India. Now India is actually becoming a global superpower, and China is already a global superpower. So Sri Lanka's political future will also have to be determined, or will also be greatly affected by these two countries. If we see these political debates going on at the moment with respect to various national resources in Sri Lanka, sort of leasing out some of the national resources, you can see how these two nations and their influence have come into play. So this is again a real political challenge for many tiny nations in Asia, the superpower struggle and political competition. And scholars have already sort of argued that this is actually not a new thing to the world, because the Western dominance for, let's say, around 300 to 400 years. But apart from that, most of the world's economy was dominated by either China or India altogether. So what we're actually experiencing at the moment is a kind of a going back to the default stage, that is India and China dominating the world economically. But now the new scenario, they will also be trying to dominate the world politics, also militarily as well. So within that context, how these two countries will manage their traditional rivalries, their disputes, it's really crucial to the political future of the Asian region. So in addition to that, Asia is also entangled with political instability, weak governance, and also Western interventions in their countries, particularly in places where there are civil wars. So there are a number of ongoing, long-standing civil wars or civil conflicts in Asia. Myanmar's internal conflict, particularly related to different minorities in Myanmar asking for self-autonomy, including the issue of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. Indonesia, the Papua conflict, the movement for an independent Papua. The Philippines experienced a number of conflicts, and still there is a Maoist movement in Philippines. And it's also had separatist movement for an independent region called Mindanao. That is also, even though there is a peace deal, that conflict is still going on. The war in Afghanistan has not come to an end, even though US intervention is likely to be gradually sort of reduced in years to come, but it's still very contingent at this stage. The transformation of Taliban from extremist ends to more mainstream politics will taken place. Iraq and ISIS or ISIL insurgents in Iraq, it's actually not a civil war, it's a complex emergency because it's more than a war. Thailand is having a problem in its southern territory. The Bangkok occupied or annexed the southern territory a century ago, which is primarily a Muslim-dominated area. So there is movement for separation and independence. Syrian civil war is another complex emergency. Different parties have involved the Western superpowers, Soviet, Russia, United States. And the war in Yemen is a similar prototype of the Syrian civil war, another political emergence. So, what are the reasons for these ongoing civil wars in Asia, which leads to political instability in the region? So these civil wars and complex emergencies indicate failures in primarily state formation. That means when these states were formed, they have in their formation been somehow failed to manage their diversity. Now, when it comes to state formation, it is essential that the state attempts to manage its population, get the consent, the ideological consent of the people to live in that state. This can be done through various means of distribution of power, either at the political center or at the periphery. Constitutional reforms and smooth transition of power. Now, for example, if we take the case of Syria, the Bashar al-Assad's government controlled Syria for a long period of time, and also same with the Yemenis Ali Abdullah Saleh, who did not prefer to go for a smooth transition of power to his successor. So when governments fail to do political reforms at the right time, and that is one of the main reasons for the emergence of civil uprisings. That's again broadly an issue of governance. So what we see in Asia, also with the influence of Arab Spring towards the Arab region, is lack of transition of power, having constitutional reforms and bad governance. So how Asia is going, these countries in Asia are going to find solutions to these problems. That's a major challenge. Are they going for sort of Western brokered solutions, or are they capable of finding their own solutions to these problems? But somehow none of these civil wars are actually not confined to their own territories. Most of these civil wars are actually internationalized internal conflicts. That means they have an international character, and different parties, different power centers in the world have involved in these conflicts. So, kind of an extension of the same issue, the Asia is also known to a number of unresolved political conflicts that are having an interstate dimension. Now, previously I talked about the civil wars that are internationalized internal wars. And also Asia is having some of the long-standing interstate problems. India and Pakistan issue over Kashmir, which is one of the longest unresolved problems, which has led to political tension. Even in the 2018, 2019, there was a lot of tension between the two states. So South Asia, for example, South Asia is having a kind of a regional arrangement, the SAARC. Those regional arrangements have also sort of not been able to produce any sort of a sustainable solution to these problems. And also these countries are nuclear powers, and Pakistan also having a great deal of great number of terrorist outfits in the country. Produces a huge risk to the rest of the world, particularly to India. And the Tibetan issue is another case. The Chinese occupation of Tibet, and Tibetans have not been able to sort of get their autonomous region as they have wished. It's another political issue that has been continuing for a long period of time, more than 50 years, 50, 60 years actually. The South China Sea issue is another ongoing interstate problem in Asia. A number of islands in the South China Sea, it's claimed by China and some other countries, mainly Philippines. So Philippines is a US ally, so United States is also involved in the issue. So North Korea and South Korea problem is another unresolved political conflict that is emerged after the Second World War, with the polarization of North Korea towards the communist bloc and South Korea towards the liberal bloc in the world. So these issues continue to progress in Asia without a kind of a proper solution. So how long that Asia could be a region that has continued a number of civil wars, a number of interstate conflicts, number of ideological conflicts, and also different forms of very much sort of a contrasting forms of government. If you think about, for example, probably the most peaceful regions in the world, like Western Europe. Western Europe had so many conflicts up until the Second World War, but that has transformed itself towards one of the peaceful regions in the world. So how that transformation had taken place? What's the secret behind it? Why we do not see a single civil war in this Western European region like the way we see in Asia? So what led to this transformation? Now, those are some of the crucial questions that we need to ask when we think about building sort of a oneness or a social or cultural cohesion as Asians, or sort of build when it comes to building a more broad regional sense as Asians. Now, another issue that I want to sort of draw your attention is about this issue of modernization. Now, when we use the word modernization, it in a sort of has a relationship to the Western conception of modernization as well. But anyway, the issue is most of the Islamic communities in Asia are accused of not being able to modernize themselves. So Asia is also home for a number of Islamic groups. Those who want to exercise a hardcore or radical form of Islam by refusing to, accept or absorb modern social values, norms, and ways of life. If we think about Asia, the Muslim population is very much, dispersed in Asia, particularly in South Asia. So currently, Iraq and Syria as regions have become the epicenter of Islamic terrorism, according to Professor Rohan Gunaratne. Initially, the epicenter of Islamic terrorism was Afghanistan, and now it has shifted to Iraq and Syria. And Professor Gunaratne predicts that in future, the epicenter of Islamic terrorism will be East Asian region. So the epicenter shifts from one region to the other in Asia. And these groups, these radical groups, those who preach hardcore practices that are very much sort of outdated or difficult to be sort of adhered to in modern terms, and also not sort of in terms with the modern ideas about civilization and humanity. There is this great accusation to the entire Muslim populations for being sort of contributive towards promoting such kind of aberrant versions of radicalization within their populations. So in addition to that, in addition to these extremist forms of radicalization, Islamic republics, particularly in Middle East, also known for sort of not catching up with social, cultural, and political changes in modern society, particularly when it comes to gender issues, women's rights. Now, Saudi Arabia, for example, gave right to vote for women in 2015. After a long sort of a political advocacy and campaign for women's right to participate in elections. And also there are a lot of issues with respect to religious freedom in some of these states, social entertainment, sexual rights, issues of child marriages, and so on. So these problems have some kind of a replication of how the West previously saw the Asian states. Now, it is in the similar fashion that Western states, as I have mentioned at the very beginning, like Edward Said mentioned, Westerners had a gaze towards Asia, interpreting that or thinking that they are uncivilized, pre-modern, not modern, not modernized, uncivilized, barbaric, mysterious cultures. So this, in a way, now is coming up from other majority communities in Asia against the Muslims. But whether this particular gaze towards the Muslim communities from other majoritarian communities in different parts of Asia have a validity for their claim. Now, that is something that we can argue and debate. So since there are a lot of growing tensions between Muslim minorities and other majorities, such as Buddhists in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, Hindus in India, in other Southeast Asian countries, there are issues related to modernization because some of the majority communities continue to see some of their minority Muslim groups as groups that are not being able to modernize themselves with some of the cultural practices. Part of this is also related to this concept of ethnocentrism, which means that sort of looking at a particular community from one's own perspective rather than putting oneself in others' own perspective. So rather than sort of practicing cultural relativism to relate, to see the worldview of the other community from their own perspective, there is a continuing trend of some of the non-Muslim communities in Asian countries practicing ethnocentric approaches towards the Muslim communities. So this has been a serious issue. For example, if you have read about the issue in Myanmar with respect to Rohingya Muslims. So how politically correct is this? And that's another question. Sort of to replicate the similar Western gaze towards Asians, and again the Asian majority is sort of replicating the same kind of a gaze towards their Muslim minorities. But anyway, this is not to say that there are no issues with the Muslim communities. Indeed, they have been very much resistant to change. Some of the colonial writers in Sri Lanka, near Ceylon, have noted that the Muslim community in Sri Lanka is a community that has been very much resistant to colonial modernity and change. They have not changed their names, for example. They have not changed their ways of life. So that is their way of cultural life. But how politically correct these different approaches, these approaches towards Muslim minorities by some of these Southeast Asian and South Asian countries? That's another question. And actually, I think it is also a kind of a ongoing problem, and it seems that there will be more similar type of problems in time to come unless there is some kind of a sort of a reconciliation and understanding between, or dialogue between these different communities. So in addition to that, Asia is also experiencing a rise of inequality in terms of income distribution and resources, especially in places like India. These are actually political economic problems. So part of this is connected to actually the neoliberal governmentality or neoliberal economic agendas of governments, the art of governance of various populist governments like Modi's government, India, that favors the interest of big businesses rather than ordinary citizens. So what we really mean in a nutshell by a neoliberal form of governance is to construct an alliance, as you can see, between the political elite and the big businesses. So the economy operates in favor of the political elite and big businesses. So political elite is actually representing the policy making part, the governance part. So decision making is done in favor of the big businesses, big companies, multinational corporations. That is what we call the neoliberal form of government in a nutshell. But in contrast to that, there have been in the history some more sort of more different forms of governance. That is, one is the social democratic system. There, the alliance is, rather than the big businesses, the political elite or the government maintaining an alliance with the people or the particularly after the Great Recession in 1930s, the world experienced the emergence of social democratic capitalism, where governments ensured that there are enough jobs for people. Universal employment was sort of enforced. People, the governments created jobs. If not jobs, the people got some kind of an allowance. So with that, rather than governments working for the interest of the big businesses, governments work for interest of the people. So these are the two different forms, and these two different forms of governance have various economic implications as well. For example, if we think about the neoliberal form of governance, when the economic governance is done according to cater the interest of big businesses, then the resources, the labor need to be directed for them to make use of. But when it comes to social democratic system, it's the public interest that stand interest of the big businesses. So what we see as politics of inequality in current forms of more recent forms of governments, particularly in South Asia, this neoliberal form of governmentality has led to various social discriminations. Because when governments encroach, for example, the land belonging to the public or indigenous people, that creates a problem. So in India, for example, this classic example of Red Corridor, which facilitates the Naxalite movement as well, where the land belonging to more traditional Adivasi people forcibly taken, they have been forcibly evicted by the government, and the land is actually given for big businesses for various activities, mining, deforestation, and so on. So people, along with these forms of discrimination and also other social discriminations like casteism, they have joined rebel groups and facilitated and supported rebel groups. And that is how movements like Naxalite movement in India continue to sustain. So politics of inequality in that sense is another major problem, because Asia, in some places, you can see Latin American standards. For example, in Sri Lanka, you can see, if you in Colombo, you can see Latin American standards. But if you go to some of the peripheral regions, it's more like sub-Saharan Africa. No water, people have to walk long distance to get drinking water and so on. So this disparity is there. So the interest, the alliances, the macro level alliances in terms of economic governance is important, and they have recently created so many political issues and social movements, public uprisings against the government. So these things also need to be looked at when we conceptualize a kind of a idea about One Asia or cultural linkages, because these political issues need to be sort of addressed if we think about some sort of a more syncretist social cohesion among different groups of people in our region. So to overcome some of these long-standing unresolved political debacles. It is essential for building, it is essential to have sort of a more innovative approaches to deal with some of the long-standing problems in Asia, because they have been there for decades now. India-Pakistan problem, the civil wars in some of the Southeast Asian countries. Even though sometimes the civil wars are over, the political problems continue to persist. So when is Asia going to sort of see an end to these political problems? That is a main challenge. If Asia to sort of conceptualize some kind of an analogy to Western Europe. So anyway, Asia is not a place for a great deal of political homogenization. For example, promoting liberal democracy across Asia is I don't think it's practical, because Asia is immensely diverse and a different context. Also, Asianness, when we say about one Asia or building some sort of a Asian identity, we should not sort of we should not sort of mistake or made the mistake an Asian ideology or some kind of a reified essential category called Asia. The term Asia or Asianness should be approached from a very syncretistic perspective, sort of being open to other cultural and political categories or lessons that we can learn from Europe and Western world. So only through that Asia can learn about how to sort of transcend some of the political problems that I have mentioned. However, critically engaging with the Western constructions and Western ideologies about Asia is an important first step, finding innovative solutions to these problems. I said that I'm not going to be more prescriptive about these problems, but I'm just throwing in some of the ideas so you can also think about these things. Now, for example, if we take the case of Sri Lanka, one could argue that Sri Lanka's ethnic problem is mainly a result of its democratic legacy. The ethnic problem in Sri Lanka got politicized due to the fact that how democracy, which is introduced to us by the Western colonial masters. So Sri Lanka's ethnic problem is a kind of a result of how democracy was practiced in Sri Lanka, or it's a result of the democratic legacy in the country. So when democracy was left with after the independence, it automatically politicized the different ethnic groups, different groups in the country. So then that had produced a political power struggle between political elite based on ethnic. So this is actually a common case not only to Asia, but to African region as well, where the colonial masters, the Western colonial masters, when they ruled these colonies, the most of the time they facilitated some selected groups, some selected ethnic groups, mostly minorities. But when they left by giving, mainly the British colonies actually, by giving democracy to these countries. But whether these countries were mature or whether they are cultural, I don't think we can use the word mature, but whether they are political, social and cultural realities do not necessarily fit with the democratic practices was not assessed. So because of that, when the democracy is left, it created new majorities and new minorities. So sometimes the communities that were favored by the colonial masters became political minorities when the democracy was exercised in those countries. So as a result, we saw a series of civil wars in most of the post-independent nations in Africa and Asia. So sadly, still, as I have mentioned before, most of the Asian countries have not been able to sort of overcome these political conflicts. And they are also being sort of facilitated or being advised by the Western pundits of how to resolve these problems. So one challenge that lies with Asia or Asians is to sort of discover some kind of a formula to address this politicization of democracy, because democracy, and when it gets practiced in context where there is high sensitivity to identities, it automatically gets politicized and produce um, um, adverse consequences. Now, anyway, this is not to deny that democracy is bad, it is Western, and we should not totally reject it. That's not the argument, because that argument was also there. For example, in 1990s, there was this argument of Asian values, saying that democracy is a Western and we Asian value system is different. And there was also more tendency to emergence of autocratic governments, endorsing autocratic leaders and so on, and sort of having a kind of a cynical approach towards democracy and human rights also. But now that argument is actually no longer there. So democracy is also the way out to these problems. But the manner in which that democracy needs to be customized in Asian countries, or the manner in which how democracy can be revisited in Asian countries, one of the main political challenges that remains in front of the Asian countries. So with that, I would like to end my small presentation, and I would like to open the forum Q&A. Thank you very much.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
In past, many of the Asian countries had a king ruling the country, but today many of those countries are ruled by politicians. Whom do you think had built a better Asian community?
Well, now if you think about now, there are some countries in Asia still there are kings. For example, now if you think about the most developed countries in Asia like Japan, there is a king, so it's a constitutional monarchy is there. So I think it's quite difficult to judge who has built Asia sort of in a better way. But we got to understand that during the periods of monarchs, whether the Asian states had the kind of similar sense of nationalism like the way they are having now. Actually, it was during the periods of various kings, it was the loyalty to different kings that is what mattered at that period, rather than a sense of sort of a statehood or sort of belongingness to a particular nation or sort of a nationalistic ideology. What has happened during the transformation from these monarchies to maybe liberal democracies is this loyalty from a particular person to loyalty towards states or a particular nation has come into place. So in that sense, I think those are two different political systems, and it's I don't think it's a kind of a fair sort of a judgment assessment that we sort of try to assess what was done during the periods of kings and what is done now. But anyway, we got to also keep in mind that in the modern liberal democratic states, we have citizens, and citizens, they have rights. So the individual, the rights of the individual and the identity of the individual has been transformed, probably from a slave to a medieval serf to a citizen. So republics, what do we mean when we say republics in modern terms? That means that citizens, those who control, citizens, those who elect their representatives, even though they are in corruption and all, that's a different story. But in terms of individual rights, there is a huge transformation. So anyway, I think those are two different political systems. I don't think it's a kind of a fair assessment to sort of frame that question in that way and sort of assess whether kings have done better than so that's my response. Any other questions? Anyway, it's an interesting question because you see that most of the times nationalist politics, you see that there is always this reference to past, the greatness in the past. Because but we also need to think about when we create history, we are very selective about our history. So we only select the instances where we are really comfortable. So we don't really see the more disastrous experiences under monarchies. So that is what we call the collective amnesia within people. So they sort of forget the bad experience, and they kind of glorify certain events in the past and recreate their past. So history is some kind of creation that we make that we make at this moment. So we also need to understand that as well. So it's very difficult to sort of assess in that sense whether the monarchy is the period the monarchy is the best period than that. So I think it's quite difficult to sort of assess. Any other questions? Anyway, thank you very much for that question.
Okay, sir.
Any other questions?
One more question, sir. What's the difference between constitutional monarchy and absolute monarchy?
Yeah, now absolute monarchy, the monarch has the absolute power to control, but in constitutional monarchies, the king is there, there is a parliament and there is a constitution. So there is a prime minister. For example, Bhutan is having that. Nepal had in early 1990s, the king was there, but there was a prime minister, and then elections were conducted. But that is not the case in some of the other countries where sort of the absolute power lies with the one person, the king. So there is a compromise between constitutional monarchies and absolute monarchies. Now, if you think about Japan or Australia is a constitutional monarchy because head of the state is Queen of England. New Zealand, Great Britain, those are can be considered as constitutional monarchies. Any other question? Hope I have answered your question. Is it clear?
Yes, sir, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions,
Any other
please?
question?
No, then we can wind up the session. One of our students is there to make vote of thanks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to deliver the vote of thanks on behalf of the students of the short course on cultural linkages towards an Asian ideology. First, I would like to thank our lecturer, Mr. Nuwan Herat, for sharing his time and knowledge with us and for delivering this lecture amidst his busy schedule. Your address set the tone for this course by clearly indicating the role of politics in building an Asian community. Thank you, sir, for being with us today. We are blessed to have you contribute to this course. Next, I wish to thank Dr. Hemantha Premaratne and any other staff and personnel of KDU involved in bringing these lectures together. Thank you very much. Last but not least, I thank all participants from our university for joining us today. Your participation has made this lecture a successful event, and I believe it has provided you with an insight into the political issues and challenges in Asia. To conclude, let me once more express my gratitude to Mr. Nuwan Herath for delivering today's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nuwan. Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Hemantha, and the Dean of the Faculty, Mr. Kitsiri Amarthunga. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for listening to me, all the students. And thank
Please
you very
wind
much
up.
for asking some interesting questions as well.